Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the UNFCCC Pavilion. We have an amazing discussion today. Some of you may have come to yesterday's forward-looking, futuristic discussion that we had with some of today's participants. It was on climate finance, and we have a similar one today on the very exciting topic of disinformation and misinformation and the quest for the truth. Very quickly, I'll go through our very eminent and distinguished panel, 2 seconds on each. First, from the left, the very eminent author, Kim Stanley Robinson, author of Ministry for the Future. You probably all know him. And he's been very gracious in appearing in many of our events in this COP session, and we're really happy to have him here. Thank you, Stan. Next to Stan is Nazanin Mushiri, who has led climate change issues across the Berghoff Foundation's conflict, transformation, and peace building work, and has been a very prominent reporter in many news outlets, including Reuters, Independent Television News, and Al Jazeera. Next to Nazanin is Atossa Sultani, who leads the global strategy for the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Initiative. And she has founded Amazon Watch for 2 decades and has founded awareness movements as well, and is producing a documentary on nature-based climate solutions at the moment. Next to her is Tom Mitchell, the director of the International Institute of Environment and Development, and a very close friend of the UNFCCC, and especially all the foresight initiatives that we are undertaking in combination with him, not just now, but in his previous capacity at Climate Kick. And then finally, Johan Rockström, one of the world's most eminent scientists, who's the director of the Potsdam Climate Institute and also the creator of the Planetary Boundaries. And so you can see that we have an amazing thought diversity of participants here. And the topic that we're talking about doesn't really get raised in the negotiating system that much. The notion of abusing information in order to move people away from appreciating the crisis that we are heading towards and the necessity for urgent action. And we have not really devised instruments to counter that, to move mindsets in the right direction. Disinformation, misinformation is a challenge against science, it's a challenge against ambition, against action, and against the truth. So interestingly, a couple of days ago on Wednesday, a declaration on information integrity on climate change was launched, which is the first manifestation of seriousness that countries and entities have taken. A few countries are members of this. It's a nice surprise. We haven't had anything like this before, but it's a first seed of attempts to promote accurate information and to counter disinformation and denialism. And so the question I will ask the panel, and we'll go in 2 rounds, is that in a world that has democratized the ability to spread disinformation, so it's become so easy to employ and abuse platforms in order to move mindsets in a direction that really counters all the efforts to increase ambition on climate change and the need for climate action. In such a world, and where technologies are advancing so rapidly that enable this to happen even more intensely as we move into the future, how can this process, or everyone who's surrounding this process, how can we decolonize the climate information space from the propagandists? I mean, normally when you have wrong facts, you can counter it with correct facts. When you have propaganda, it's very difficult to counter it with facts. You need propaganda, but then that puts us in the realm of the bad guys as well. And so that's the conundrum we're trying to deal with here. So with that, I will give the floor to our first speaker, Stan.
Thank you again, Yusuf, for this opportunity, which I appreciate very much. I will speak briefly and then join or observe the panel going on. And because this is the topic of our discussion today is effective storytelling, I take a personal interest in it, being a storyteller myself as my career and profession as a novelist and as a science fiction writer. And when you set a story in the future, your audience is immediately and rightfully skeptical because you have to be making it up. And so what's plausible in that story becomes very important to the reader's appreciation of it. So I've had to think about this a lot, and I'll toss out the simplest of my observations as a hopeful prompt and hope to hear more from the panelists about it. So we're in climate change already. It's happening around the world. The glaciers are melting, the ice on the planet is melting, the storms, the droughts, they're all happening such that when climate change was an idea that scientists were telling the world was happening, then that tested your belief in science. But when your town burned down, or when you had to leave because there was no water, you're more inclined to believe the story, the explanations being provided by science. So things are easier now because there's actually individual sensory evidence for almost everybody on Earth has witnessed something that can be explained as climate change derived, and therefore the explanation, the correct explanation that we've raised global temperatures by fossil fuel emissions is a story that should be conveyable to everybody. And so I'm saying that those of us who believe this is important, we're working from a position of strength. And the disinformation crowd has to use tricks, rhetorical tricks, and believe me, rhetoric, the art of persuasion is powerful. And I'm going to say that because the story that you believe in going into a new encounter with new information has a huge impact on how well you can take in new information. So the pre-existing story that you have, call it ideology, call it worldview, there's a selection bias. So you'll take in the stories that, that seem to confirm your already existing paradigm, and you will reject or misunderstand the stories that somehow do not seem to, they contradict what you already believed, and somehow you don't see that or you reject it out of hand. It therefore becomes possible to say it's really important to, in fighting climate disinformation, to always shift up to the meta level of what did you believe beforehand and why did you believe it, and then to insist to everybody on this planet, you believe in science. And you can insist on that to them, and you can run this test. When you are scared for your life, for your physical existence and your ongoing life, when you're fearful of death for yourself personally, you run to a scientist, and that's your doctor. So what is required out of this is the insistence that all of the sciences are consilient, this is an E.O. Wilson term, with each other. You could say roughly that the physics underlies the chemistry underlies the biology underlies the sociology, and then the psychology, so that even the notoriously skittish human sciences are nevertheless sciences because they gather evidence, because they gather data, analyze it, test theories, and they use the scientific method to study even human beings and their actions. And the whole pyramid of scientific thought is consilient across the board. So I always use this challenge, and especially with climate denialists. If you deny climate change, you should not go to the doctor anymore. Just live with what you've got. And of course, they'll break an arm and run to the doctor. So we're all hypocrites to one degree or another, but the hypocrisy of climate denial can be called out at every moment. Science is not truth. It's facts, and facts have this is Bruno Latour. Facts are things that we've agreed upon to not have to investigate every more. And out at the edges of the scientific method, it's not so much facts as theories and hypotheses within which you hope to make a structure of facts. So we're not arguing for truth, we're arguing for a scientific rigor, which is not quite the same thing. Let's talk about what's been established by using the scientific method, which is the most powerful intellectual methodology invented in human history, in that it actually does make things and change things. So, climate denial as a industry, it imitates the scientific method in order to try to sound plausible. And so it does cherry pick, of course, but it says, well, here's the evidence for my denialist theory. It's always crap evidence. So in scientific conferences, they often have a late session, often late at night, called I Call Bullshit. And so around the room they'll go and the scientists will say, well, I call bullshit on this or that. One time I said, I call bullshit on the singularity, and everybody laughed their heads off, although that's an easy call. But part of countering climate denialists is to call bullshit, so there needs to be a regular cross-examination. Like the debate societies at Oxford and Cambridge, simply take the stage and say, they're wrong in so many ways, and here's how they're wrong. They've misused the evidence, and play the game of the debate. But at every point, you can always compare them to the tobacco industry. Naomi Klein in Merchants of Doubt has made it clear that it was actually tobacco damage denialists that were rehired to do climate denialism by the fossil fuel industries in the 90s. So it's not just a historical similarity, it's actual individual hired experts that are denialists and giving out this evidence. And at all points you can say, look, we now know tobacco kills you. And if you didn't believe it, you died of lung cancer, or your loved ones died of lung cancer. There have been so many deaths from tobacco that almost every person on earth has a family member or a friend that died of tobacco. Maybe that's more true of older people than younger people, I hope so, but it's generally true. So the lines of the argument need to be targeted like a debate society, and when they are, because science uses the scientific method, and I'm going to say this, reality is on our side. And also, reality bites. You can live in a fantasy world for a while. You can live in Trump world for a while. Reality will bite, and sometimes it bites hard. Berlin 1945 was reality biting on the dreams of a few people who overtook that government at that time. We don't want it to get that bad, but it's a good analogy to use that when you've got reality on your side, you should be able to win the argument. So I will leave you with that thought, with the idea that let's do a better job of defending reality and see what happens.
Thank you so much for that opening provocation, Stan. Excellent insight. And I won't waste everyone's time by commenting on anything, so we'll go one by one after the other, to give their own perspective of the question that I posed. It's interesting that everyone will have a different angle. So we'll go with Nazanin, where you have the journalistic angle, the reporting angle, how the public perceives the truth and how you manipulate it. Go ahead, Nazanin.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me well. So look, just one thing I would say is that this is from a journalist perspective, but also the work that I'm doing at Berkhoff Foundation. We've been working a lot on disinformation and peace building. And I think there are a lot of correlations there between disinformation, peace building, and disinformation and climate. Disinformation isn't just a crisis of truth, it is a crisis of trust. And in divided societies, and a lot of the areas that I work in which are conflict affected, storytelling can really rebuild that trust and make truth possible. For example, some of the work that we've been doing at Berkhoff, just very simple, a radio show in Somalia where we've been explaining what actually is climate change and how does it affect you, and what tools do you have to combat it. That's made truth more possible in that particular context. So I would say that storytelling can be an antidote to polarization. And also I would say that disinformation exploits emotion, not logic. And people in the world that I'm in, so whether journalists or people who are working in peace building, they know how to work with that emotion. And I think people who are working in communications around climate can learn a lot from this. And they can learn a lot from the stories of shared resilience. I just want to give one example of where things went really wrong and where I would say that we need to debunk some of these issues, and we can't wait for others to debunk them. We have to debunk them before they're manipulated, before disinformation takes hold. So in the spring of last year, you may remember there were these power outages in Spain and Portugal. And very, very quickly, there was a blame game, a finger pointing at renewable energy. The Daily Mail, the British newspaper, the US Energy Secretary came out and blamed renewable energy. And it was absolutely false. It was not renewable energy that was responsible. There was a voltage outage in Spain and Portugal, which created havoc. People getting stuck in elevators, all the power going out, people getting stuck on trains. And unfortunately, the damage has been done. When you look at the surveys in Spain now, a lot of people still believe that renewable energy was to blame. And that's a big, big problem in a country where renewable energy is responsible for around 50% of the energy on the ground. So we need to combat this face on. We can't wait, otherwise it's too late. And the impact is really, really stark on the ground. Thanks.
Hello. Thank you for having me on this panel. In the work I do in the Amazon basin to defend the rainforest and protect indigenous peoples, the frames that are perpetuated by the dominant economic system are some of what I'd like to bring up. It is those frames that help people make sense of what's happening. It's a sense-making, perhaps, more than the information. And I agree with you that people don't necessarily remember facts, they remember emotions. And frames help people make sense of reality. And I would say we are up against some very challenging frames. The challenging frames that indigenous peoples face in a daily basis in the front lines of the fight to protect the Amazon are things like they're standing in the way of progress. The frame of progress, which basically supports the expansion of a resource-intensive, life-blind economic system that seeks to devour the basically vital organs, the Amazon rainforest being a vital organ of the biosphere, seeks to devour and convert forests, these spaces for life, where life flourishes and water circulates and carbon sequesters, all the things we need fundamentally for life. The conversion of those spaces to cattle ranching, to dams, to roads, to mining, to logging is defined as progress. And I think part of the narrative that we have is to redefine progress, redefine wealth. Truly, the spaces that generate life are the spaces to be protected and restored for life to be able to flourish. And that we have brought everything down in terms of progress. And so in places like Ecuador, the government is just redefining terrorism, as domestic terrorism, as standing in the way of extractive industries. And therefore, indigenous peoples are now under investigation for things like their activities to file lawsuits to put resistance up against mining and oil industry. So I think frames are key issue in how we tell the story. And also people are confused. There is a way that social media and there's a way that, the information channels of the planet have really amplified existing worldviews and put a lot of polarization into place. So science does become critical in telling the story of basically us as part of the web of life, but also the cultural assumptions that media perpetuates do need to go beyond the traditional constructs. For example, seeing nature's natural resources, where indigenous peoples teach us that nature is actually a living system of cooperation, that it isn't just about competition, it's about responsibility. It's not just about earnings, it's about the well-being, the well-being which includes financial prosperity, but it also includes collective well-being of the most life forms, not just human life forms. So they teach us to really look at paradigm, because we can, debate facts, but ultimately we have to shift our value system. We have to shift the way we see ourselves in relationship to nature, to living systems, to forests, and part of the work, I think, is about bringing these new frames into practical ways. For example, rights of nature, where nature has legal personhood, allows it to basically have guardianship, allows it to be a subject of rights in the courts. Those are paradigm shifting, I guess, third horizon interventions that help us really reconnect with fundamental solutions that aren't just replacing carbon with carbon credits, or fossil fuels with carbon credits, or fossil fuels with strategic minerals for electric cars, but help us look at the relationship, the interdependence of life, and how we fit into that basically web of life. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Yusuf, for the invitation, and to my other panelists. So I want to draw out, I think, three maybe complementary perspectives. The one is that the climate misinformation and disinformation that we refer to here in some ways is a predictable product of a fundamental calculation that was made in the establishment of the multilateral environmental agreements and the structure that we have around the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which fundamentally says that the better we understand the science, the clearer the evidence, the more we can support cooperation to act on that evidence, will change human behavior. And the underlying psychological premise of that is that there is a deeply rational connection to clearer and clearer scientific evidence, and there is attention paid to that as it changes, as it goes on, and that fundamentally results in changed human behavior. But it goes back to what other panelists have said here, is that it misses the kind of the emotional hook, but it also now misses the fact that we have a social media environment that is guided by algorithms. It is tuned to human behavior. It is about reflecting back a set of narratives that are fundamentally not anchored in that scientific rationale and the connection to human psychology. And that is a state-sponsored set of climate denial instruments, or at least climate disruption, information disruption instruments, where on the kind of progressive side, as I would couch it, there has never been that degree of state-sponsored coordinated action. Certainly not the level of money and coordination that has gone into that. And that's feeding this sense of despair, of division, and so on. It's a kind of fundamental human emotions that can be played on by politicians and media leaders and so on. So we've created this kind of reactive architecture to that fundamental notion of kind of science leadership and science rationale, which means the sense of commitment within the media structures that we have is being questioned. But then on the other hand, if you actually ask people, do you care about climate change? Do you want your governments to act on climate change? Is it something real in your communities and so on? Overwhelmingly, there has been a consistency of commitment to that. So on the one hand, we're seeing a kind of a false information landscape being constantly perpetuated, but in people's, the way in which they want to see change happening, it is not consistent with the two. But I think there is a whole other sphere here that we don't tend to talk about very much, which is that that sense of climate denialism is rooted in an industrial revolution architecture that is anchored with this kind of neoliberal capitalism that is not something that we kind of talk about now in kind of fluffy terms, but is actually deeply anchored in the rules and regulations of society. It is the kind of the way in which you've built that system and you've anchored that system through those rules and regulations that in the climate sphere we barely ever talk about. So my organization has been trying to develop something called the hidden handbrakes. The things that actually are ending up being really extremely boring, but they're almost intentionally boring because the media doesn't cover it, they don't talk about it, it's too arcane, but it is the fundamental rules base of the system to anchor that system in place. Let me just give you 3 examples of those things. I'll try not to be too boring. One is the system of currency. Right? So there's a design system of currency essentially anchored around the US dollar, which means in order to be able to maintain currency stability around the world, governments spend billions every year in currency stability, way more than climate finance, way more than development finance, and that money effectively flows back into a US dollar, US system. You can go and do the reading on this, but it's incredibly constraining on anybody doing anything on climate change. Second is the system of protections for investors in fossil fuels, which is anchored within treaties. Over 2,000 trade treaties anchor these protections. It's supported by something called the Energy Charter Treaty that some people know about, and that is then further supported by something called the ISDS process, which is an arbitration that basically says if your government does something bold on climate action, you can be sued by fossil fuel investors because it undermines the value of the asset and the investment. And go and look it up. There's about 100 billion being channeled from governments back into fossil fuel investors under this system. The last one that I'll highlight, and there are many, many more of these, is the system of credit ratings. And credit ratings are fundamentally there to characterize risk of investment. But they consistently highlight that places outside of the kind of core Western sphere are deeply risky, and that within the Western sphere it is safer. But what it doesn't do is ever look at opportunity. It doesn't look about the future. It doesn't encompass value. It doesn't think about climate futures. It is there really to play off a fear of risk of finance. And those 3 things together, just those 3 highlights, reinforce the fact that not only climate misinformation and disinformation, but there is actually an anchoring regime in the rules base of society that makes it incredibly difficult to actually act. But the process that we've really got to go through now, if we're going to tackle climate change fundamentally, is to start to shift those rules in important directions. And I would say we have now an incredible tool in our armory, the ICJ advisory opinion, which could well be a game changer. It may well not be a game changer in this process. It may actually see the end of this process in the UNFCCC. But in terms of an overall approach to start to dismantle some of those elements, it gives a fighting chance. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And just to comment immediately, because it's a nice segue from Tom here, that I fully agree that the ICJ advisory opinion is a potential game changer. And it's also very reassuring because it would never have accomplished its advisory opinion if it wasn't standing on the floor of a very, very mature consensus on climate science. It is simply the hard work of scientific assessments, the IPCC being like the absolute consensus floor of rigor we stand on, and that has not been shaken in any way. And you can only get the kind of business leadership and a legal example like the ICJ advisory opinion, but also the fact that statistics, as Tom just pointed out, even post-Trump and even in this populist, nationalist, extreme right-wing drive we have today, the headwinds we're seeing, statistics still show that 60-70% of citizens, basically across the entire world, still are concerned about human-caused climate change. They trust science, and they want a solution. So there's been very little deviation here. But still, we have the assaults on science. We have the denialism right on our doorstep. And the question is, what explains this mismatch? And I would argue that it's very simple. It is a disproportionate, loud noise from a few actors who are polluting the digital highways, but also, back to Naomi Oreskes, it is some really heavy influential actors that continue to invest in not actually real denialism, unfortunately, because that is the simplest to deal with, but more this confusion creation, building on the tobacco industry reference that was made earlier. And just to give you one example here, when President Trump dismantled the National Climate Assessment in the US and handpicked his favorite skeptics to write the Department of Energy report, he was, of course, aiming at getting a real denialist debunking report that would basically fulfill his denialist position, that this is just a hoax. I don't know if you've checked that report, but it's actually a very harsh criticism against their own president. It's actually a report that does confirm that humans are causing climate change. It does confirm that this is causing temperature rise on planet Earth. This means that the Department of Energy report, in my view, is much worse than Donald Trump, because it's a report that is so kind of, let's say, cleverly crafted that it simply says that, well, we're causing this, but it's not worth to do anything about it because the costs of solving it far exceeds the benefit that we will reap if we just let this go. Actually, US agriculture will benefit in their yields. And temperatures beyond 2 degrees Celsius, the scientists can't agree. That's the kind of confusion that I think we should really be worried about, because when we look at citizens, we can classify them in 4 categories. One is a small portion of pure climate denialists. We place Donald Trump in that camp. They are very few loud voices with disproportionate airspace. Then you have the skeptics, and the skeptics are the ones that I think we should really counteract, because they are the ones that are trying to manipulate the scientific findings and are kind of spilling beans on the fact that science will always be associated with uncertainties. There will always be complexities. So that is, I think, where we have to really go in hard with a counter story. And then you have the vast majority of citizens who are quite agnostic, actually. They have many challenges in life, and they're not against, but they're not for. They tick off the box of being concerned when you're asked, but they won't step up and be on the streets, because the final category are the champions. These are the ones walking the corridors at COP30 in Belém. And that is the population pyramid that we have to understand in order to really put our efforts in the right place. And I would say that the place we should focus on is the counteract, the revival of skepticism. And I say revival because for those of us who have been around for quite some time, it basically died out after Paris. We went through almost a decade with calm and a quite fact-based and healthy environment. And now it's coming back, and it's coming back very fast. Assaults on science, denialism, yes, but also kind of skeptic, tactical, really moving very, very effectively on the entire digital highways we have. And it has to be handled. I agree with you, Youssef, that this has to be kind of killed down very rapidly. When it was pre-Paris, our assessment was generally that it was basically the Anglo-Saxon societies that were dominating. It was almost like a Murdoch-operated misinformation landscape. If you remember, I mean, it was US, it was Canada, it was the UK, Australia. You did not have any problems really in Europe, neither in Latin America, certainly not in Asia, and not in Africa. Today, it's coming back in a new way, and the question is how to respond to that skepticism. And just to close by saying, we are now discussing quite actively to create a kind of a a counteracting, let's say, like a digital war room to be, let's say, responding to all this misinformation by simply bombarding with truth, bombarding with all the basic scientific messages that we have, because we are in such an enormously privileged position of becoming so far, as Kim pointed out, reality bites. I mean, that's one very, very strong part of this narrative. But all the evidence we have means that we can be much more forceful in counteracting the misinformation we're seeing. And I think we need to recognize that we have underestimated the exponential pace of this, and that we need to actually invest in counteraction, but not the denialism, the skepticism, and just go hard on that assault that we have today. And I think that is doable, but it requires concerted efforts.
That was a brilliant first round. Thank you to all. Now, to make life a bit difficult for you, I will ask you for your top 3 or 4 proposed actions that can be taken, whether in our process or realistically outside. To make it a bit easier, I will capture everything that you said in 4 categories. So you might want to address any or all of these or otherwise. First, you talked about worldviews, I think. We talked about the era of the Industrial Revolution that we're living through, which comes with its own rules and ways of thinking, and that maybe we need to drill down to the meta level to see what ideologies determine how we accept or not accept certain pieces of information, and the sense-making story within that, and how different parts of the world have transcended that. For example, in giving legal personhood to rivers or to ecosystems. So that whole notion of worldviews, and how do we deal with this? Because that's at the core of everything. 2, cognitive bias, which is some of the whole notion of working with emotion, knowing how to tweak people's thinking and direct them in a certain way, not necessarily using rationality, but knowing how to affect them. We know that the world, economically, politically, psychologically, values short-termism more than long-termism. And so this is one of the cognitive biases we have. The notion of facts. What is a fact? It's just an accepted thing that can change tomorrow, and people play on that. Reality bites. So when people find a place that takes them to a zone of discomfort, they'd rather stay in the zone of comfort, no matter how inaccurate that is. Third is actions. We've seen actions taken before in other contexts, especially the tobacco context, but there may be other lessons. So if you could think of other areas, I know Nazanin mentioned conflict situations and how information was used there. So are there any lessons that we can take from that? And finally, how this process works, how the IPCC works. I remember in COP2, I was a delegate for my country. I was the delegation of my country, and the first scientific debate happened there for and against the second assessment report of the IPCC. The tagline there was, "The balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on the climate system." It's just ingrained in my head because we were fighting over it so long. And half the world, or a small portion of the world, said that means that there's enough uncertainty for us to do nothing. And the others saying, no, it's a warning call, and the precautionary principle mandates that we should do something. But beyond that, the way we communicate science, in the IPCC documents, I think I heard the sixth assessment report was 28 kilograms of books. The way the summaries for policymakers go through a political filter and are adjusted there makes it very difficult for the normal person at the receiving end to take this and act on it. So what can we do about the process itself, and how inherently it goes against the objectives that we want? So I leave you to that with the second round. Stan.
Well, thank you for that provocation. The only thing I can think of to add to what I said before is to say thank you to the other panelists for their thoughts that clarify and expand. And then also, I guess, to focus on the timeline that Yusuf ended at, short-termism over long-termism, that it's often said that human beings are most concerned with the day's necessities. And I think there's a lot of truth in that, of course. But we evolved into human beings by way of language. Language came to us, and also the concept of the future. And while there may be other species on this planet that have a concept of the future, the human ability to imagine the future is a great power. And really what we need to rely on here is to insist on the importance of more than the day's necessities, and that even the day's necessities will become problematized if we don't take care of the long term as well. So this fights against all kinds of laws and practices that value the short term, like high frequency trading. The short term goes down to nanoseconds. And then in ordinary capitalist practice, it goes to quarterly profits and the shareholder value that is estimated for that very year or the next report, such that if you can make a lot of money in the present, the fact you've destroyed the future doesn't matter because you feel you can cash it out. So insisting on long-termism is a different human ability. You can talk to people about their children's lives, and enough people have children that they can see that their children's lives are in trouble. For people of my age, you can talk about your grandchildren. You see your grandchildren, and it's not at all hard to imagine that your grandchildren are very quickly going to have grandchildren themselves in a world that could be devastated, to the point that those lives will be ruined if they happen to exist at all. And that prospect of ruination, as frightening as it is nevertheless the stakes that we're talking about. So the longer you can stretch the timeline discussion, and indeed this is a science fictional thought, the higher you can raise the stakes and the more you can talk about reality biting. So never accept present value in any discussion whatsoever. When you end up with a debate with skeptics, you can always double down and say, that may be true for now, but if we don't do something now, in 100 years, sea level will be 4 meters higher, and civilization will crash. And so always take the long view, and then I think the advantage is on the side of reality and of the reality of having to deal with climate change.
Thank you for that. That was fascinating. Couple of things I want to say. Reality bites, and it's good that we're uncomfortable here. It's good that we're feeling hot. It's good that we have protesters out there on the streets, making a lot of the leaders here feel uncomfortable. And I think there's a connection there between reality and feeling uncomfortable, which I think is a good thing. But one thing I wanted to say was, yes, we need to decolonize from the propaganda, but we need to defossilize from the propaganda as well. And I guess I'm here because, as a former journalist, I can sort of say things and be a bit more direct than maybe others. And the fact is, we have too many fossil fuel lobbyists here still. And if you look at what happened in Jamaica just recently, where you had a Category 5 storm, and you look at the fact that the fossil fuel lobbyists outnumber the Jamaican delegation by 40-1, then you start to sort of see the reality of a situation. And unfortunately, disinformation, and partly fueled by these fossil fuel lobbyists, corrodes trust. And yes, storytelling and good journalism can repair it to a certain extent, but when you're fighting this big system, it's incredibly difficult to do, and it's becoming harder and harder. And the reality is, another reality is that we have very little time to cut emissions in half. We have very little time to become carbon neutral. And unfortunately, if we don't get the right information out, we're not going to get there. And it's becoming harder and harder to get that right information out. So a request to all of you sitting here on your phones, some of you feeling quite uncomfortable in the heat, please do get out there, get on social media, do flood the information space out there with the right information, with the facts which are out there. And I think it's really important that all of us take responsibility for that and all of us put the right information out there. Thank you.
I also agree that the crisis we face is a civilizational crisis. And the solution in where we go and how we basically align with life is a civilizational question. And partly we are suffering from a lack of imagination and a lack of belief of what could be possible because our democracy is captured by capitalism and our media and public institutions are financed by basically the finances are coming from industries who are grappling with their own survival. So we have a civilizational crisis, and our problem definition isn't deep enough. Partly we're not reaching that undecided public. We're fighting for the hearts and minds of not the convinced and not the corporate captured, the ones that are trying to meet their bottom line for the next quarter, but for the undecided public. The undecided public sees a barrage of information about this problem, the hurricanes, the floods, the corruption, the wars, and there is a feeling of overwhelm. And so they're shutting down. We're not reaching them partly because we're not talking deep enough about the crisis. I think when we get to the place where we can really speak to the interconnectedness of all of these problems. Like last year, there was the worst drought in 125-year history here in the Amazon. I was here for a month, and the river that I was on, actually by the time I left, there was no river. You had to literally the river was receded every day. And a few weeks after I left, it was 2 kilometers away from the village where our boat was stationed. The boat we were stationed at was on the sandbank. The river was interrupted. Millions of fish died. It was after a 2-year recorded history of drought. Few months later, literally a few months later, there were the 2 worst mega hurricanes in the Atlantic. One in Charlotte, North Carolina, and one in Florida. And there was not any stories in the media that connected the two. And in fact, I'm part of the science panel for the Amazon, and there is a connection between deforestation, climate change, drought here in the Amazon, how water cycles around the planet, and how the water is not coming in, being cycled through the forest here, and instead creating larger available hot weather and vapor in the Atlantic, feeding more hurricanes. Now, there are many complex things that go into that. It's not just a simple cause and effect, but we know that the heart of the planet, controls the weather system. And when you tell that story, and you also say, in fact, springtime rain in California, the biggest breadbasket on the planet, is driven by Amazon rain. People in California start to care about what's happening in the tropical countries and start to see that they need to be involved in a global stewardship of systems of life and life support systems. So I think partly we need to speak, for myself, I think what the industry does well is raise doubt. Raise doubt in an environment of polarization, overwhelm. We lose the people who could be our potential allies. Raise hope through telling a story of what's possible, making a new normal of things like rights of nature. Once we had slavery, once women couldn't vote, we've moved beyond that. We have moved to acknowledging rights of humans, rights of women, rights of indigenous peoples, and now we're here to talk about rights of nature and rights of future generations. And people start to move with us, the new normal. So I think we need to shift the wind of what's possible. We need to speak holistically and deeply to the problems are and give hope, because we have been looking at, in our work at the bioregional level in the sacred headwaters, how we have to protect the forest, which protects the water cycle, which allows life to flourish, which is the foundations of the economy, and that how this continent, you could say, the fact that could reach the people who care more about economy than ecology, that's 70 to 80% of the economy of this continent is dependent on Amazon rain. And the Amazon rain patterns define half of the flow in the Panama Canal. So when there's a drought in the Amazon, there's a congestion in the global system. But so we have to make these linkages, and we have to let people understand Earth systems and know what a better place to start, and make sure that by the time people graduate from high school, they understand Earth systems, they understand global tipping points, they understand atmospheric rivers and rainforests and Earth systems and how they're part of that, both physically, biologically, and also emotionally and spiritually. People are in this crisis of also understanding what is the role of humans in the web of life. And I think we can bring people down to experiential learning, not just intellectual learning. When I take executives to the rainforest and they sit with communities after a week, they've completely reprogrammed the way they see the world, their role as to be good ancestors to future generations, the important knowledge that indigenous people have about how to get out of this crisis through connecting at a collective level and valuing things that truly matter. But the neoliberal programming that we've been through for the last 30 years, the neoliberal experiment has also made us feel like we are personally responsible for the problems, and that the solutions come from personal action, which I'm not saying they're not, but I'm saying the bulk of the problems are going to come from systems change and changing the goals of the system from GDP to gross ecological product, changing values that underpin that system to the interween and the flourishing of life being part of what brings back the returns. The financial returns come when there's ecological returns. And we can show that. Circularity shows when we invest in circularity, we invest in ecological flourishing, there are prosperity as a gift to us. But if we only seek prosperity, we miss the whole. Anyway, that's kind of my soliloquy for today.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll be quick because I know we're running out of time. And I also have got a lot to feed off from other panelists. So 3 very quick things. Yusuf asked us to be kind of propositional and practical. So first thing is, I think, Johan, you've highlighted the possibility of kind of flooding with fact. I wonder whether we could supplement that with whether Tosso is highlighting, and also flood with messages of hope and solidarity off that fact, because facts alone don't play on the human emotion in quite the same way. And I think at the moment we're feeding despair and distrust when we need to be feeding hope and solidarity. And I think that's possible through AI and generative AI and approaches. Second is, I think we are starting to see a new generation of populist, leftist, ecological leaders and politicians coming through, partly a younger generation that have been part of a Fridays for the Future movement that are now becoming part of a political sphere. It's not the young people, the teenagers anymore. Actually, it's the people who are into their mid, late 20s and early 30s, where actually we don't have a school for political leadership on the left. Not really. We have very few consistent, connected programs of capability development and networking. But the value of narratives of a populist green leader that ties that to issues of wealth tax and so on, just as the example in the UK is that the new populist leader, Zach Polanski, has gone from 9% in the polls to 19% in the polls in the blink of an eye, partly due very smart communications and narrative creation. Last thing I'd say, third point, is that with the ICJ advisory opinion and actually multiple others over the past year or so, we have the basis to actually go after some of the people who've been the biggest funders of climate denialism on the basis of environmental crime. And I think there'd be a really interesting approach to see whether or not there's also a flooding, but is there also an opportunity to actually start to weaken the other base? And we've not really tried that in a concerted effort. It would be interesting to see now. Thanks.
Yeah, so I would actually argue that we know what we need to do, and I even think it's really doable. It's not simple, but it's definitely doable. And first of all, just inspired by Kim and your work, you know, we have just in the last few months been forced to communicate that we basically, on our watch, very likely have passed the first tipping point, collapse of the tropical coral reef system, livelihoods for over 400 million people in the world. This is a catastrophe happening right in front of our eyes. How many people know about that across the world? I would argue quite strongly that the most important number in the world is 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial levels. It's a temperature we haven't seen on planet Earth over the past 100,000 years. We've only existed as modern humans for 200,000 years. We've never experienced anything like this, and now we're heading towards 2.5 degrees Celsius, which would wind back the climate clock 4 million years. If I walk down the streets in Berlin and ask 100 people, what do you think about 1.5? I would be lucky if I found one person who knows what the hell I'm talking about. This is a huge failure that we've not been able to get the science and the core message out there. And that's why I totally agree with Nazanin here. We need to flood the world with the basics, and we should not underestimate the need for this. And we've experienced this before. During the COVID pandemic, we were all flooded every day by the same message. We're in trouble, we have a global crisis, it threatens your life, put on your mask, wash your hands, stay at home. Every day. Very boring, very dark, very, crisis-oriented, but we stood up collectively as one humanity, and we actually pushed ourselves in the right direction. I think there is some basics here that we simply have underestimated the strength from. And just to say that we have the tools here, because I forgot to say earlier that this Department of Energy report, the skeptic report that in a way is critical to their own president, was completely debunked by science in a few hours. Science just stepped in and killed that report page by page, line by line, and now it's in the dustbin somewhere. How did we do that? Well, it was very simple. We have all the facts. It's just to load them out there. So I think also you can have automated algorithms that can just pump out the basic scientific evidence we have. And then finally, I totally agree with you, Tom. It's no point to just flood with the diagnostic and the risk. We should also thank Trump. Let me say something positive then finally about the Trump administration. He has forced us, which we actually started doing before he came into office, but he's helped us to really reconfigure the story that a science-driven transition to a decarbonized future is the winning pathway. It's the pathway towards security, towards health, towards prosperity, towards equity. It's not a sustainability journey. It's a journey for everything we want to achieve in a modern, technologically advanced future. The coal mine is history. We want to go into the future. I think these are some very basic ingredients that we all have, we all know them, but for some reason we're failing in getting them out there in the highways. And I think that is, in my view, the first step in this journey.
Brilliant, and I wish our contact groups were this enlightening and insightful and producing such concrete results, because just to recap, what I gather from this is our next steps is a groundswell, is a bottom-up process that we all have to implement without waiting for someone to do it for us. And very quickly, one is a call for action that deals with both the left and the right brain. So flood the information space with facts, including the basic facts of 1.5, but also the right brain, inspiring hope, inspiring solidarity, because you need imagination and the belief of what can be possible. Second is also the importance of science education for the youth. And it's not just for their education, but we've seen how the youth advocates have now grown up to become politicians themselves, but still we haven't serviced them with the proper narratives to enable them to get the attention that they deserve. Third, that we need to insist on long-termism as a driving force, just as we insist on science to be the core driving force here, because short-termism is misused and abused as a reason to not take action. And finally, we need to capitalize on the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice before that ship sails away, because right now it's hot enough for us to be able to move ahead. So we won't take any more of our time. We've already exceeded our time by 6 minutes, but at the end, let us give a round of applause for our panelists. And thank you so much for a very, very good conversation. Thank you for coming. Thank you.